Extremist man insults Karoline Leavitt over her necklace in the street. Instantly regrets it. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the bustling city streets, where the rhythm of everyday life played in perfect sync. Karoline Leavitt, dressed in an elegant yet modest attire, walked with purpose, her polished heels clicking against the pavement. Around her neck, she wore a delicate gold chain adorned with a pendant that held deep significance, one that had been passed down through generations. It was more than an accessory. It was a symbol of heritage, resilience, and unshakable belief. As she made her way past a line of vendors selling flowers and freshly brewed coffee, she felt an unusual tension in the air, an undercurrent of hostility that was almost imperceptible yet present. And then, like an ember igniting dry leaves, a voice sliced through the calm. "You should be ashamed to wear that in public." The words came like a lash, venomous and filled with contempt. Karoline stopped mid-step, turning towards the source of the insult. A man stood a few feet away, his presence radiating a rigid intensity. His features were hardened, his stance confrontational. Dressed in a worn leather jacket, his clenched fists and narrowed gaze made his prejudice palpable. The street around them seemed to slow, conversations muted, eyes drawn toward the unfolding confrontation. He gestured aggressively toward her necklace, his expression twisting into one of disgust. "People like you think you can walk around flaunting your beliefs, spreading your poison. But we know the truth." His voice rose, dripping with extremist fervor, seeking validation from the bystanders who now observed in silence. Karoline inhaled sharply, steadied herself, and met his glare with unwavering composure. She had encountered intolerance before, but the sheer malice in this stranger's voice made her stomach churn. Her instinct was not to cower, but to stand her ground, not out of defiance, but out of principle. "And what truth is that?" she asked, her voice calm, deliberate. She refused to let anger dictate her response. "That freedom only extends to those who share your views? That history should be rewritten to suit your prejudice?" The man's face darkened, his fingers twitching as if ready to unleash more vitriol. Yet, something in her poise unsettled him. The crowd, sensing the weight of the moment, held their breath. This was no longer just an argument on a city street. It was a battle of ideals, an unspoken challenge of whether hate or dignity would prevail. As the tension thickened, an unexpected shift occurred. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice firm yet compassionate. "She has the right to wear that, just like you have the right to your beliefs," she declared. Another voice chimed in, and then another. A ripple effect of support spread through the bystanders, turning the tide against the extremist hostility. The man, who moments ago had stood emboldened by his own righteousness, now found himself outnumbered, not by force, but by conviction. His face contorted with frustration, but no words came. The moment stretched, then broke. With a final glare, he turned on his heel and stormed off, his departure met not with jeers, but with quiet triumph. Karoline exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. Today was not just about standing up for herself. It was about proving that courage in the face of hate could inspire unity in ways no act of aggression ever could. As Karoline walked away from the scene, her pulse still thrummed with the residual tension of the confrontation. The voices of the crowd had faded into background noise, but the intensity of the moment lingered in her mind. She had faced intolerance before, but never so publicly, never so directly. The weight of her necklace, usually a comforting presence, now felt heavier against her skin. It wasn't the gold or the delicate craftsmanship that made it valuable. It was the history woven into its existence, the generations of resilience, the struggles and triumphs it represented. As she moved through the city, she couldn't help but wonder, had the man truly believed in his hatred, or was he simply a product of the ignorance he had been fed? And more importantly, how many others thought as he did? The thought unsettled her, not because she doubted herself, but because she knew this was not an isolated encounter. It was a symptom of something far greater. Her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice calling her name. Turning, she saw Daniel, her closest friend and confidant, hurrying toward her with concern etched into his face. He had witnessed the exchange from a distance, his hands clenched into tight fists, his body coiled with unspoken fury. "Are you okay?" he asked, scanning her face for any signs of distress. Karoline offered a small smile, though the edges were tinged with exhaustion. "I'm fine," she replied. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He knew her well enough to recognize when something had left a mark, even if she wouldn't admit it. "It shouldn't have to be something you deal with," he muttered, shaking his head. "People like that, they thrive on fear. If no one stands up to them, they think they can just keep spewing their hate without consequence." Karoline sighed, understanding his frustration. "And if we respond with anger, they win," she said simply. "That's what they want, to provoke, to divide. But we fight back by being better, by refusing to let them define us." Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He admired Karoline's ability to remain composed, but part of him wished she wouldn't have to. "You know, I've never understood why people fear what they don't even try to understand," he said. "It's like they're terrified that accepting someone else's truth will somehow erase their own." Karoline nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Because it's easier to hate than to learn," she said. "It takes no effort to reject someone, but it takes courage to question what you've always believed." As they walked together, the tension from earlier slowly began to dissipate, replaced by something more resolute. Karoline knew this wasn't the last time she would face someone like the man from earlier, but she also knew that each time she did, she had a choice: to retreat or to stand firm, and she had already made her decision. As they reached a quiet cafe, Daniel gestured toward an empty table. "Come on," he said. "Let's sit for a while." Karoline hesitated, then nodded. As they settled in, she glanced down at her necklace, running her fingers over the pendant with renewed determination. This was more than jewelry. It was a statement, a legacy, a silent promise that she would never allow hate to define her. She would wear it proudly, not just for herself, but for everyone who had fought before her, and for those who still had battles ahead. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as Karoline and Daniel settled into their seats at the cafe. The initial tension of the encounter had faded, but the weight of its implications still lingered. Karoline stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze lost in the rippling surface of the dark liquid. "It's strange," she murmured, "how a single moment can reveal so much about the world we live in." Daniel, leaning back against his chair, studied her carefully. "It's not just about that man," he said. "It's about what he represents. You saw how people reacted. They were shocked, but no one stepped in right away. It's like they were waiting for permission to care." His words settled heavily between them. Karoline had felt the hesitation in the crowd, the brief moment where silence had almost allowed hatred to win. That was what disturbed her the most. "I think people are afraid," Karoline said finally. "Not just of men like him, but of confrontation itself. They don't want to get involved because it's easier to pretend it doesn't concern them." She paused, fingers tracing the chain of her necklace. "But it does. Hate spreads when no one stands against it. And the more we ignore it, the bolder it becomes." Daniel nodded, tapping his fingers against the table in thought. "You should talk about this," he suggested. "Publicly, I mean. Share what happened. Make people see why it matters." Karoline exhaled, her expression unreadable. She had never been one to seek the spotlight, but she also knew silence was not an option. "Maybe," she said softly, "but it's not just my story. It's bigger than me." She glanced out the window, watching as life carried on outside. People laughing, walking, moving through their day as if the world had not just tilted for her. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the barista, a young woman who hesitated before setting their drinks down. "I just wanted to say," she said quietly, eyes flickering toward Karoline's necklace, "what happened back there, I saw it. And I want to say thank you for how you handled it." Karoline blinked, caught off guard. The woman, no older than 20, fidgeted with the hem of her apron. "I've seen that kind of thing before," she continued. "But I've never seen someone face it like that, with dignity instead of anger. It made me think." Karoline smiled, warmth spreading in her chest. "That's all we can ask for," she said. "That people think, that they question what they've been taught." The young woman nodded, as if something had shifted within her, before turning back toward the counter. As she walked away, Daniel let out a low whistle. "See," he said, "you're already making an impact." Karoline chuckled, shaking her head. "One person at a time," she murmured. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the day. The words of the extremist, the murmurs of the crowd, the quiet but powerful shift that had begun in the cafe. A spark had been lit, and she couldn't ignore it. With a deep breath, she reached for her phone and opened a blank page. If she was going to speak out, she needed to do it right. Her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed the first words. "Today, I was reminded why silence is never an option." Karoline sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone as notification after notification flooded her screen. The video of her confrontation had taken on a life of its own, circulating through social media, news outlets, and even reaching political commentators. Some hailed her as a symbol of resilience, while others twisted the narrative, calling her reaction performative or overly sensitive. She had expected mixed reactions, but the sheer scale of the response was overwhelming. A deep sigh escaped her lips as she scrolled through the messages, her emotions swinging between gratitude and exhaustion. She had merely stood her ground. Why did that feel so revolutionary? Why did standing up to hate, something that should be so natural, make her the center of controversy? A sharp knock on her door broke her trance. She hesitated before opening it to find Daniel standing there, his expression a mix of excitement and concern. "You need to see this," he said, pushing his way in. He set his laptop on the table and pulled up a news site where a panel of commentators debated her actions. "Some are calling you a hero," Daniel said. "Others not so much." Karoline watched as a middle-aged man in a crisp suit scoffed at the footage of her holding her ground. "This is just another example of people looking for attention," he sneered. She wasn't attacked, wasn't harmed. But of course, in today's world, if you don't agree with someone, they'll turn you into a villain. Karoline clenched her fists. "That's not what this was about," she muttered. Daniel nodded. "I know, but that doesn't mean people won't twist it." He met her gaze seriously. "You need to decide. Are you going to step away from this, or are you going to own it?" Karoline exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I don't want to be a symbol," she admitted. "I just want people to think, to question what they accept as normal." Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. "Then make sure that's what they remember," he said. "Control the narrative before someone else does." His words struck a chord. She had spoken out once. Could she do it again? Not just for herself, but for those who had been silenced. The thought was terrifying, but also necessary. She wasn't looking for attention. She was looking for change. And perhaps this was the moment she had been avoiding for too long. That night, Karoline drafted a statement, choosing her words carefully. "This isn't about me," she wrote. "This is about the world we accept, the biases we ignore, and the silence that allows hatred to flourish. If my story has reached you, then let it be a starting point, a reason to question, a reason to stand up, not for me, but for the next person who might not be able to." She hesitated only briefly before posting it. Then, she closed her eyes, knowing that the storm had only just begun. The bright studio lights cast a warm glow over Karoline's face as she adjusted the microphone clipped to her blouse. Across from her, the journalist, Emily Dawson, offered a reassuring smile. "Take your time," she said gently. "I want people to hear your story, not just the headlines." Karoline nodded, inhaling deeply. The nerves in her stomach coiled tightly, but she reminded herself why she was here. This was about more than a viral moment. It was about standing up to something far bigger than herself. The cameras rolled, and Emily started with a simple question. "Karoline, can you tell us about that moment? What was going through your mind when that man confronted you?" Karoline exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. At first, I was in shock, she admitted. Not because it was new to me, I've seen hate before, but because it happened so openly, so unapologetically. And the worst part? No one reacted immediately. It was like people were waiting to see if it was bad enough before stepping in. Emily nodded, her expression serious. That hesitation, she said, is something many people experience. Do you think society has become desensitized to moments like these? Karoline considered the question. I think we've been conditioned to believe that silence is the safer option, she said. That if we ignore something, it will go away. But that's not how hate works. It grows in silence. It thrives in apathy. The interview continued, covering everything from the significance of her necklace to the online threats she had received. Have you ever considered stepping away from this, given the backlash? Emily asked. Karoline hesitated for a moment. I'd be lying if I said I haven't thought about it, she admitted. But then I remember why I stood my ground in the first place. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has ever been silenced. If I step away, I let them win. And I won't do that. The conviction in her voice was unwavering, and Emily seemed to sense the gravity of her words. One last question, she said. If you could say one thing to that man, to anyone who thinks like him, what would it be? Karoline looked directly into the camera, her voice steady. Hate is a choice, she said, and so is change. The question is, what choice will you make? The interview aired that night, and the reaction was immediate. The clip of Karoline's final statement spread like wildfire, appearing on news segments, social media, and even international broadcasts. Within hours, hashtags emerged, some in support, others in condemnation. The polarization was staggering. While many hailed her as a voice of reason, others saw her as a threat to their worldview. But the most unexpected part? The man from the confrontation had resurfaced. A video began circulating online, an older clip of the same man at a rally, spewing hateful rhetoric. His identity had been exposed, and the consequences were swift. His employer released a statement condemning his actions. Former acquaintances spoke out, describing years of extremist behavior. It was as if the world had turned its gaze upon him, forcing him to reckon with the very intolerance he had projected onto others. And then, in an even more shocking twist, another video appeared. This time, it was him, sitting in a dimly lit room, visibly shaken. I never thought this moment would come, he said, his voice hoarse. But I need to say something. He looked into the camera, his eyes heavy with something Karoline couldn't quite place. I've spent my life in anger, in hate. I thought it made me strong, but now, for the first time, I see the cost. He paused, swallowing hard. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I do need to ask, how do you unlearn something that's been ingrained in you for so long? Karoline watched the video in stunned silence. She had expected resistance, maybe even escalation. But this was something else entirely. Her phone buzzed. It was Daniel. Did you see it? He asked, his voice unreadable. Yeah, Karoline breathed. I saw it. There was a long pause before Daniel spoke again. What are you going to do? Karoline didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since this all began, she realized that change, real change, was not just possible. It was happening. Karoline replayed the man's video, searching for any hint of insincerity, any sign that this was just another attempt to manipulate the situation. But what she saw in his eyes was raw, uncertainty, regret, maybe even shame. The weight of the public backlash had clearly shaken him. But was that enough? Could someone so deeply entrenched in hate truly change? The question gnawed at her. The comments on the video were mixed. Some believed in his remorse, saying everyone deserved a chance to change. Others dismissed it as an act, a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. And then there were those who demanded justice, arguing that one moment of reflection couldn't erase years of harm. Karoline understood all of it, but as she stared at the screen, she felt something unexpected, empathy. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the realization that this man, no matter how misguided, was still human. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Emily Dawson. I know you've seen the video, the journalist said. And I need to ask, would you be willing to meet him? On camera, Caroline's breath hitched. You're asking if I'd sit down with him? Emily hesitated. I know it's a lot, but people are watching. If there's any chance of a real conversation, this could be it. Caroline closed her eyes, weighing the decision. Everything in her screamed that he didn't deserve this platform. And yet, if there was even the slightest chance that his change was real, could she afford to ignore it? After a long pause, she answered, I'll think about it. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a small community hall with a quiet, controlled atmosphere. Caroline walked in with steady steps, but her heart pounded in her chest. Across the room, he sat, visibly nervous. Gone was the aggressive posture, the defiance. He looked smaller, as if the weight of his own actions had finally settled on his shoulders. Emily positioned herself between them, moderating the conversation. Caroline, she began, why did you agree to this? Caroline exhaled, keeping her gaze steady. Because people always say they want change, but no one wants to do the work, she said. And I need to know, are you doing the work, or are you just trying to save face? The man, whose name was revealed to be Richard, swallowed hard. I don't know how to answer that, he admitted. I wish I could say I had some grand epiphany. But the truth is, when I saw myself in that video, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. His voice cracked slightly. I've spent my life being angry at things I never really understood. And now, for the first time, I'm questioning why. Caroline studied him, searching for deception. But what she saw was someone at a crossroads. And what do you want from this? She asked. Because if you're expecting a redemption arc, I can't give you that. Richard shook his head. I don't expect anything, he said. I don't want to be that person anymore. And I don't know where to start. For the first time, Caroline felt the tension in her chest ease, just a little. Change, if it was real, wasn't instant. It was a process. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of his. The footage of their conversation aired that evening, and the response was unlike anything Caroline had seen before. People debated, argued, questioned whether Richard's remorse was genuine. Some saw it as a breakthrough, proof that even the most hardened hearts could soften. Others dismissed it, believing it was nothing more than an attempt to escape the consequences of his actions. But something had shifted. The conversation had sparked a broader discussion, one about accountability, about growth, about whether society should allow space for those who seek redemption. Caroline received messages from people who had once held views like Richard's, admitting that her words had made them think. Parents reached out, asking how they could teach their children better. Even former friends of Richard's, who had shared his extremist beliefs, began questioning their own convictions. And yet, with the progress came new threats. You're giving a platform to hate, some accused. You're letting him off the hook. Others sent her messages of anger, some even of violence. Daniel urged her to step back, to take a break. But Caroline knew that wasn't an option. If anything, this proved just how deep the wounds of hatred ran, and how much work there was still to do. One evening, she sat down to write. Not a response, not a defense, but a message. To those who say people cannot change, I understand your pain. I do. But if we close the door to growth, we do exactly what they did to us, shut out what we don't understand. I'm not asking you to forgive. I'm not asking you to forget. But I'm asking you to believe in the possibility of something better. She hit post and closed her laptop. Whatever happened next, she had made her stance clear. Weeks passed, and the world gradually moved on. The debate continued, but the intensity of the storm began to settle. Richard had started attending workshops on deconstructing extremist beliefs. He had lost his job, faced public scrutiny, and was now trying to rebuild a life based on something other than anger. Whether he would succeed, only time would tell. Karoline, too, had changed. She had never sought to be an activist, never wanted to be the face of a movement. And yet, she had found herself in the heart of one. Through it all, she had learned that standing up to hate wasn't just about defiance. It was about resilience, about knowing when to fight and when to listen. One afternoon, as she walked down the same street where it had all begun, she caught a glimpse of herself in a shop window. The necklace, still around her neck, glowed softly in the sunlight. A symbol of the past, a symbol of resistance, a symbol of hope. She smiled to herself. The world wasn't perfect. Change was slow, but she had done her part, and that was enough. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice